everybody. Welcome to the Ministry Builders.Church podcast. We're so glad that you took this opportunity to tune in and check out this episode. Here at Ministry Builders.Church, we're just passionate for the local church, and our heart's desire and passion is to see the local church make more disciples, grow more leaders, empower more people for the work of ministry than ever before. My name is Wayne Lanier, and it is an honor and a privilege to be with you. Today, I've got a great guest on the podcast today who I am just so thankful for, and I'm looking forward to this conversation around intentional ministry within the local church around healthy relationships and marriage. And so I want to welcome my friend, Dr. Rick Marks. Dr. Marks, how are you, sir?
I am relaxed. And yourself, buddy?
I'm doing good, man. I really am so appreciative for you joining me again and being a part of these conversations, and really
Our
thankful.
hearts, our hearts have always been aligned in strength in discipling the church to be healthy and mature, to love maturely, to relate well.
Yeah.
Because the healthier the people are, the healthier the church is. Right?
Yeah. So, Dr. Marks, for those who may not know you, why don't you just take a minute and just, introduce yourself. Tell us about you, your family, your work, and what you do, and yeah. So, just take a minute, introduce
All right.
yourself.
So I go by Rick, not Dr. Rick Marks, but just kind of Rick typically. But I do have a PhD in counseling psychology, two master degrees, one in ministry therapy, one in education from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and ordained Baptist minister. Although I tend to be a little too ecumenical for them because I'll serve anybody. I even done work with the Catholic Church because strong, healthy marriages and families affect society in a healthy way, right? And I really believe the church needs to be intimately involved in strengthening marriages and families, not just within their congregation, but also the community. Because we also know that the health of the community is linked to the health of its families, and particularly its marriages. And so it's been my passion. My wife and I have been married 39 years as of this podcast coming up in February 2024. It'll be 40 years. I've been with that lady a long time. And we live by the things that I teach. We both grew up in broken homes where there's divorce and addictions and abuse. I was around 10 or 11. My dad bought a cow prod, which shocked us. So I didn't grow up in a lot of health. I grew up in a lot of dysfunction. As an adult, I had a lot of healing and growing up to do, even after I got saved. And so when I went into ministry, I was in the Navy as a chaplain assistant, and God called me to full time ministry. And I thought I was supposed to be a pastor, Wayne, but through a series of events with the Navy and post active duty, while I was still in the reserves, the Lord made it clear I was going to be helping disciple the church to be healthy. And so my ministry has always been an area of family ministry and counseling, helping the church become healthy and mature in love. Why? The world is watching. Our kids are watching. My kids were watching. And as Jesus said in John 17, when he prayed that his body might be one, he tells you why. I pray they might be one so that the world will know that you sent me. He makes it clear the disunity that is in the church is evidence to the world that Jesus did not come from God. And I'm like, wow, why don't we really pay deep attention to that? And that disunity has nothing to do with Bible knowledge. It has to do with how we treat each other, how we relate, how we connect to each other, whether we're mature in love or not. And that has been really been my focus, and it's been yours as well.
Mhm.
We kind of in that we partner together, have that same vision. That true discipleship is to mature people in love. Why? So that when we talk about Jesus' love, we have integrity. They go, yeah, I see you live it, Rick. I see you live it, Wayne. I see you live it, so and so. So what you're telling me makes sense because you are that person that you describe your father being.
Mm. Wow.
And so that's kind of my heart in our ministry is called Relate Well. I have a core curriculum called Relate Well. And we actually teach people, single, dating, or married, the fundamental principles of skills, and the keyword is skills, how to become a healthy, mature person, and how to relate well in all aspects of life so that you can be mature in love and and really represent Father's heart well, be it marriage, family, or in the world of your community around you. That's
Great.
what we're really about. So that's
Awesome.
me.
Man, that's you. It's awesome. Great. I love it. Thank you. And so today
Hmm.
we're going to talk about intentional ministry and intentional ministry being developed around the area of healthy relationships and marriage, which is a broad spectrum. And I think sometimes, at least in my experience, we we might do some stuff around marriage in particular, but not necessarily in this area of overall healthy relationships. One thing I discovered, and Dr. Marks, as you know, I've been in what I call big church world for a long, long, long time, and um, one of the things that I discovered along the journey was that just because we had a lot of activity and a lot of things, programming, stuff like that happening, did not mean that we were being impactful or effective, in particularly effective. So
Yes.
through that, just in kind of growing along the path, realizing that it takes intentionality. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why it's important and what does it mean to be intentional around this. Why is this important? Why is this important that the church is even takes up this banner, if you will, around this area?
So um, we're to take the word intention and link it to its greater to the motivation behind the intentionality. So, and I can do that through a story. Many years ago, there was a large church here in Jacksonville, and the executive pastor called me and said, "Man, we got so many divorces coming out of the woodwork over here, and they had for a while because they've been referring to me for counseling for years." And he goes, "We need to talk." I went, "Okay, come to the office." So I scheduled for to go meet with him. His name is Glenn, and Glenn had a pad of paper out, Wade. He goes, "Let me tell you what we're going to do. Next year, we're going to bring in this person to do a marriage retreat. And we're thinking about doing some other things." And I said, "Put your pen down." He said, "What?" I go, "You asked me here. You need to know how I think first before we have a conversation." And then I began this conversation. I said, "You guys have a ongoing," and these are the key words I said to him. "You have an ongoing and sustainable preaching ministry, don't you?" He said, "Sure." "You have an ongoing and sustainable worship ministry, don't you?" "Yes." "You have an ongoing and sustainable life group ministry, right?" "Yes." "Youth ministry?" "Yep." "Children's ministry?" "Yep." Question: all these ongoing sustainable ministry you have they strengthened marriages? Have they really made people healthy, whole in their relationships? And he kind of looked back. He goes, "No, they don't." I go, "Exactly. They really don't." And he goes, "Never thought of it that way." I said, "So why do you keep sustaining things that really don't impact families?" And he's like, "Never thought of it that way." I said, "So why do you have ongoing sustainable ministries?" And I'm not saying to get rid of them. I said, "But why do you support those things? Because you fund them, right?" He goes, "Yeah." "Why do you fund them?" He goes, "I'm not really sure." I said, "Because they're a value to you. You value them. You value preaching. You value worship. You value these things. And we always fund the things we value. And because it's a value, you're intentional in making sure they're sustainable." And he's really listened to me now. And I go, "So I want to ask you a question. You just admitted, and we have a lot of data, these things don't strengthen marriages, because even I'm Southern Baptist background. We do those things really well, so the Baptist world, and we have the highest divorce rates in the denomination. So let's be honest, those things don't make marriages strong." So I asked him, "What do you do that's ongoing and sustainable around strong, healthy marriages and families?" And I say, "Don't say Sunday school or life groups or preaching." He says, "Nothing." I go, "Then what would you expect?" Now I had his attention. I said, "It's not a value to you yet. And until it becomes a value, you'll always have these problems, in my mind. And it shifted in his mindset, Wayne. He goes,
Mm-hmm.
"What do I do?" And I said, "It cost you $300." And I told him what to do. And I had mentored a couple who was at their church who valued marriage ministry. And that was 7 or 8 years ago. Wayne, I have not received a counseling couple from that church in 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
You want to know why? They have an ongoing, sustainable marriage ministry. They're healing their own marriages there.
Wow. And
It's
that,
about it's a intentionality is linked to what we value.
yeah, it really is. It really is linked to what we value. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a part of the story you just shared is not unlike the journey that I personally went on that helped me to discover that activity and numbers did not equal intentionality and it did not equal effectiveness. So I had a friend who challenged me to really look deep into our what we had going on in our church context around marriage, healthy relationships. In particular, we were looking at marriage. So his premise was that to look deep to try to determine, are we really being impactful, or are we really helping these couples, helping marriages get stronger, helping families not head toward divorce but get stronger. Because if we have this idea that we're going to see our communities, our cities, our neighborhoods transformed, influenced, touched by this gospel message, then we have to determine how we're doing with the people that have been put into our care. And so I asked him to explain a little bit more, and he gave me some qualifications of which you gave. I heard you give there as well. He said you can't count the fact that you do a marriage series once or twice a year. Can't count the fact that you have a handful of small groups that read a book, uh, and but what is it that you're doing, and how many? So he challenged me to measure it. Look at how many married households were in our church compared to how many married households, married couples we were intentionally touching through ministry that we were doing. Now we did have some intentional ministry that we did. We did have some things that we were doing for sure. And so he told me that he had done this with his church and that he had found they were only touching 10% of their married households within their church with intentional ministry around marriage. And that he had challenged some other friends of his to do this, and nobody had been above 10 or 12%. So I do that. Took a while. We dig deep, spent some time really researching, looking at the numbers. I called my friend up one day and I got him on the phone and I said, "Well, buddy, I want you to know you were wrong about my numbers. I wasn't at 10%. I was at 8." so
We
so
all need a challenge in life, don't we?
exactly. Exactly. I was like, "So, I guess that means I'm hopefully I'm going to fail forward here because we've got to change some things." And we begin with your help. We begin to train marriage mentors, we train coach. We formulated an intentional plan and process and start equipping people and all of this. And here was the amazing thing. Over the course of the next year and a half, roughly, we measured that number again, and we had gone from 8% to 30%.
Wonderful.
That was just mind boggling. And so it was from that, and really, Dr. Marks, it was from your encouragement and your help and others like you that really helped me to understand that it's not enough just to be busy in ministry. The questions we have to ask ourselves, are we effective? And what are the outcomes that we hope to see? And are we seeing those outcomes and are those things being impacted? So,
When I
t-
was at First Baptist many years ago here in Jacksonville, and I was head of family ministries, and we created what was called the Center for Family Ministry, and we operated on a what I call a continuum of care model, and I borrowed that from the psychiatric hospital. Where I used to work in psych hospitals, and when a couple or a person came in for treatment, Wayne, as a clinician, I had to one diagnose the problem, and then I had to determine their level of care. Did they need inpatient? Did they need an intensive outpatient program, or do I just send them to a therapist for weekly therapy? Got it? What's the level of care? What's the level of need? And when I got on staff at a church to run a family ministry, I took the same model. Here's something that I learned, and and history bears this out. But for just people go read about it if they want to, but I'm going to just make the statement. The church, particularly the evangelical church, we abandon soul care. And it has to do with our name, evangelical. We're about converting people, but not soul care. And so when the church, particularly evangelicals, or over the early 1900s, because they saw the social gospel movement growing, hey, you can't do that, you can't abandon. So evangelicals became harbingers of truth at the expense of soul care, wounded people, broken lives. And so what ended up happening, you see this movement in the 60s, and it kind of escalated in the 70s. Soul care got relegated to therapists, Christian psychologists. So in the 70s, you began to see Jay Adams writing, Charles Solomon writing, Dr. Naramore writing, right? You began to see Christian psychologists writing books, self-help books, soul care. And then in the 80s, you saw Meredith Meyer Radio, right? Jim Dobson. What happened was the local church abandoned soul care, so the mental health community picked it up. I believe when I got to First Baptist, the church should have never abandoned soul care. But that doesn't mean we still don't need professional Christian psychologists or psychiatrists out there, therapists doing the work. But just because you have a problem and then I send you to somebody else, the church needs to have something intact to come alongside and do the one another's, to encourage one another, to support one another, to comfort you. And so we set up a ministry that had 3 levels of care. The first level was just courses, educational classes. We did classes on boundaries, we did all kinds of classes. I trained people to teach these classes. But some people need more than just education. So we had support groups. We had boundary support group. We had addiction support group. We had sexual brokenness support groups. We had support groups for people with OCD. We had support groups for people with clinical depression. We had all kinds of support groups running throughout the week. And some people need a little bit more than that. And we trained 40 what I call lay counselors. My term was spiritual encouragers. We trained them in a very particular model for doing spiritual encouragement. If you need more than that, then I had a whole bunch of professional counselors that are Christians in the city I can refer you to. But even though I referred you out to so and so, we would still say, I want you to go to these classes. I want you to go to that group. So that we as the body are intentionally still discipling you. We don't get rid of you to some therapist. We're still coming alongside and walking the journey with you, you see. And what the church has really done, it's kind of abandoned soul care and said, we're not going to walk that journey with you. We're going to let some therapists do it. Wait a minute. We have a responsibility as the body to do the 59 one other verses. Encourage one another, comfort one another, mourn with those that mourn. We just don't do that anymore. Why? Because it doesn't fit with winning people to Jesus. Besides, let's be honest, that takes time and energy on my part. And I don't want to give time and energy to somebody else, right?
right.
And so I believe the church must embrace soul care and provide some level of care to its people. Now, you might think, well, only a mega church can do that. I disagree. Many years ago, when I was really involved in the National Smart Marriage Movement, Healthy Family Movement, there were 5 African American churches in California. It's one city. They're small churches. And here's what they did, Wayne. I'm telling you, it was the most God honoring thing that they decided. Those 5 pastors, those 5 churches, put pride aside. They put pride aside because let's be honest. Well, if I send somebody to go to that church, then they might leave mine and go over there. Pride gets in the way. Fear gets in the way. I might lose members, right? But these 5 pastors put pride aside, and they're small churches. So Church A said, we'll focus on doing marriage. Church B said, we'll focus on finances. Church C said, we're going to focus we'll focus on parenting. So they came up with 5 areas they felt they needed, and then each of the 5 specialized in that area. So if a member from Church A, whose ministry was focused on marriage, had a couple where there was addiction, they sent them over to Church E. You can still come to church here, but you're to get your support over at Church E because they're the ones doing ministry for addictions. And I thought, there are 5 pastors who came together to offer soul care to their people, and they partnered together as a community of 5 churches to say, we're not big, but we can do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've never forgot that.
Yeah. And I have found that to be true. And this is one of the things that in our work through Ministry Builders and helping churches and helping them think through really what we do is just help churches think about the things they need to be thinking about and
Yes.
asking themselves deeper questions to be able to get to the answers that are going to help them do what it is they're called to do. And what I've discovered is exactly what you said. It's think partnership as opposed to trying to be the expert in everything.
Yes.
If God has gifted you or you have the right people, the right leaders for certain areas, well, great, give that attention. But why not be also intentional about finding the people within your community, within your sphere? You may have to go out and build some new relationships to do this, but find the other churches in your community that are focused on those things. There's a church over here that maybe they have a great ministry for addicts, for example, or they have a great ministry for whatever that is. And be intentional about helping people. The end goal is people. It's what we're doing with people. And so I'm with you, Dr. Marks. That's my encouragement to pastors as well. You don't have to be you don't have to have everything or do everything. You just have to be willing to walk as far as necessary with the person whose hand you've just taken to make sure they get the help that they need. I think that's just really, really critical. Could we talk a minute about? Go ahead.
I would say, Wayne, when I left working for the local corporate church, we have a ministry now that ministers to churches, but we also provide pastoral counseling and coaching for life issues. And I have won more people to the Lord through the soul care than I ever did when I was on staff and at the mega church. Mm-hmm. I just led 2 people, and I'm not bragging, but I just led 2 guys to the Lord here not too long ago. And I said, Lord, thank you that they came here because of these personal growth issues in their life where they're stuck, that helps them from growing in their faith and in their marriage. And through just coming alongside, doing the one another's, giving them skills and tools and caring, one of them goes, I want to get saved. Amen. Let him know, Lord. Mm-hmm. What do? I've partnered with some churches that are around town. Because I said, look, I'm not the local church anymore. I said, I'm the church in action, but I want to bring these people and pass them to you. I can support them in the soul care over here, but you're responsible for their spirit care. That's what you do. Mm-hmm. And it's a great partnership with ministries. There's a guy here in town who has a large citywide ministry for sex addiction. Use him. Yeah. Use him. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go replicate something that's already done unless if you can't, you're a small church, use that ministry. There is a sex addiction group for men in this city every night of the week. Sit under that guy, his name's Jerry, and let Jerry bring him into a fold and minister to him. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? Yeah. There's so much that we as ministers can do. Like you said, sometimes we feel like we have to do it all. If we don't feel like we can, then we just go, oh, well. I go, you don't have to. You can't be all things to all people,
Yeah.
but you can provide partnerships with other ministries around town to provide services. One of the largest churches in Jacksonville, and I mean, and you would know who it is, the largest churches in Jacksonville now has no marriage ministry.
Hmm.
And there's another church in town that has the only ongoing sustainable free marriage troubled marriage support group every week. That that support group is filled with members from that church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's really important. I know that's one of the things we do here where I'm at here
Yeah.
in Southwest Florida is we have these ongoing weekly support ministry for couples, and where couples can they're really discipled. Really, is what's happening with
Yes.
other people in healthy relationships. I want to talk for a moment, Dr. Marks, about relationship side. So we've talked about the marriage side of it in specific terms. I want to talk about healthy relationships in more broad terms, especially as it relates to how churches can help their young adult population, their young single population, and even getting down and maybe even especially into those high school students, and helping them learn what healthy communication looks like, what healthy relating looks like. So I'd love to talk for a minute about healthy relating and maybe how they can help begin to bring some of those things and some resources maybe that you might recommend or whatever. But I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes.
So, at the risk of sounding critical of the local church, I do want to share what you're talking about is so important. Here in Florida in 1998, it was called the Marriage Preservation Preparation Act. In 1998, the Florida legislature mandated relationship education to all high school students before they graduate.
Mm,
Now, think that through. All high school students in the state of Florida must take a course on healthy relationships before they graduate. That was 1998
mm,
because the Florida legislature understood we have to prepare people to be healthy in relationships as adults. To me, that's the work of the church. Because let's be honest, everything we do, whether you like it or not, is about relationship. When you're born, you enter a relationship. And everything we do is about relationship. Work's about relationship. Dealing with the customers about relationship. And we cannot have healthy relationships if we're not mature emotionally to handle issues that show up in relationships. So relationships are essential. So we need to be teaching kids healthy relationships. I mentored for about 2.5 years a young man named Ken. He was a youth minister for about 20 years when I met him at a larger church here in town. And he called me up one day. I want to go to lunch, and he said, "I've come to realize something. I have 20 years of youth ministry." I said, "What's that?" He goes, "We're not impacting these kids." I said, "What do you mean?" "Oh, I get them 4 or 5 hours out of the week." He said, "But be honest, the parents have more of an impact on them than I ever will." I went, "You're right." He goes, "And most of these parents are dysfunctional." "You're right." He goes, "We got to reach the parents." I went, "You're right." He left youth ministry and went into family ministry and eventually got his degree from Liberty so that he can work with the adults who work with the kids. But you still have to work with the kids. You still have to work with singles because they're looking for healthy relationships as well. So I think relationship education, if you look at our work called Relate Well, you can adapt Relate Well to teenagers, singles, or married people. You want to know why? I'm not teaching you marriage. I'm teaching you how to communicate, how the brain bonds, how it attaches, how to communicate well, how to emotionally regulate yourself so you can be slow to anger, quick to hear, so you can speak the truth in love. And we do it all through the value system of what we call humility, respect, empathy, goodwill, or we call HREG internally. Singles want to learn healthy relationships. Why? Some want to be married, but guess what? They want healthy relationships as well. And if we can get them early enough, high school, in my mind, and churches are intentional about helping kids with their soul care relationships, then we can head off problems for them later in life. And I believe that is doing the work of the gospel, because relationship education helps them mature in love. That's what it does. If I know how to relate well, then actually what I'm doing is I'm learning how to love well, because you can't love well if you know how to relate well, right? So by helping people relate well, you're actually teaching them how to love well. And that's really the heart. The greatest disease is love. Well, how do you know if someone's loving? How they treat you, how they talk to you, ultimately how they treat you. Love has a tone to it.
Mm.
And so I really strongly agree with you that one of the greatest gifts we give our high school and singles is teach them relationship education
Yeah.
through a biblical prism
Yeah.
with research-based skills.
Yeah.
And that way they're empowered to go do something. Now, I would like to say something, and the California Healthy Marriage Initiative that was heavily funded uh, years ago, and of course, you knew about this whole smart marriage movement.
Mm-hmm.
They won a $10 million grant to do relationship education statewide. I think it lasted like 6, 7 years. During that time, they partnered with churches across the country to provide relationship education to cohabiting couples, married couples, singles, and they used three prominent Christian curriculums and three prominent secular curriculums, and they tested pre and post outcome of what these curriculums were doing or not doing. We had a podcast earlier where you talked about effectiveness, or I like the word what you know what's the efficacy of this curriculum.
Yeah.
Here's the interesting thing. I'm not going to say which ones they are, but the research showed in California the three Christian curriculums create zero change, and they are very popular ones. They create no shift. The curriculums that created a shift and had created a difference, if you will, had these two things included them. They taught skills and they taught emotional regulation. Now you think, well, that's not biblical. Yes, it is, because to be slow to anger is emotional regulation.
Right.
To speak the truth in love, you have to emotionally regulate. Those skills or those principles of scripture require emotional regulation,
Mm-hmm.
which requires maturity.
Right.
So when you step back and look at it, the Bible is really maturing us in love. But most people don't know how to do that. So organizations like mine, Relate Well, others teach people the skills. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing in your church, you just don't choose a curriculum for the sake, oh, this is a great curriculum, everybody uses it. Well, guess what? It has no effect.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the three, when couples were done with it, their marriage satisfaction dropped.
Mm.
It actually made the marriage worse. And so when we looked at what the data tells us, what if we have biblically sound, research based curriculums that actually make a difference, that makes a difference in marital satisfaction and has an impact that makes a difference? That's something that I believe that churches can embrace and use for youth, for singles,
Mm-hmm.
for dating couples, engaged couples, and married.
Yeah. Yeah. So emotional regulation. Think about teenagers. For those of us that still have teenagers around, mine are on the upper end of those years. But
Mm-hmm.
te- kids process through emotion, and their ability to regulate their emotions is going to have a huge impact on their life. And as they learn those skills, they learn how to treat people, all of those factors. Then we move into, as they're moving into adulthood, if they don't have the skills for healthy relationships, they evolve into what's mostly happening today. We hang out and do the stuff that we do, which most of the things that we end up doing are unhealthy things that impact relationships. They don't make them better. So
Right.
as we wrap up this conversation, I'll kind of tail into kind of one of the ways I fell into some of this understanding, having heard people like you and others talk about it. I guess I needed to kind of have my own uh, awareness come to light, I guess is the word that I will use. So my older kids would have all their friends over, and so I've got all these high school and young college age kids. They're all hanging out at my house, and so I would be inevitably hanging out with them and sitting at the maybe at the breakfast table or kitchen table or whatever. And one of these kids would eventually wander over and sit with me, and I noticed they would start to ask me questions, and it always involved relationships. It always involved, it would either move to something like, hey, how does this dating thing even work? Like, we don't date anymore. Like, nobody dates anybody. We hang out, would be, this is the phrase that they would tell me.
Yep.
And so they would want to know questions about my wife and I, and how did I know this was the right person? How did she know this was right? How did our relationships grow? How did we did, so she and I, well, this year we'll celebrate 35 years. And so they wanted to know, how did this happen? How did you get there? And we would have these conversations, and I would share stories, and we would talk. And then I noticed the next time they were all over, a different person would start a similar conversation. This time the conversation might be around, I'm having this conflict. I don't know what to do. How do I deal with this? How do I overcome it? How do I handle it? And we would evolve into a conversation. The thing that I noticed is that every time I'm having one of these conversations with one of these young people, whether it was a teenager or a young college student, over the course of about 5 or 10 minutes of me sharing stories, they're trying to help them navigate their question, everybody in the room would eventually stop what they were doing and gravitate over to where we were having this conversation. And within a few minutes, I'd realize all of them are around me wanting to listen. And they would pipe in with different scenarios. Hey, I've got this issue in this relationship. Hey, I want to know. And so eventually, after this happened about 3 or 4 times, good news is, Rick, I may not always get there first, but I usually at least eventually get there, So
that's all that matters, right?
So about the 3rd or 4th time this happens, it finally dawns on me. So I asked them, I was like, hey, if we set up an opportunity to not only teach this, but where you could have an opportunity to discuss it and kind of work through it and talk about this kind of stuff. If I set something up and we talked about healthy relationships, we talked about healthy dating, we talked about what does marriage look like, those types of topics. So would y'all be interested in something like that? They all were like, if you do it, we're there. So I decided to test this theory out to see. So I set up a deal at our church and just set it up. I didn't even tell anybody I was going to do it. We just set it up. We, at the last minute, made it known to these young 18, 19, 20-year-olds, 22, 23, 24-year-olds. And, a handful of them showed up. The next week, the number doubled. The next week, the number doubled again. 4 weeks in, our little room had 80 plus young people packed in the room, and we would do little teaching segments, and then they would sit in circles with a few leaders, and they would have conversations for 30, 40 minutes about these things, and then we'd teach a little nugget, and they would do this. And we started doing this over and over and over again, and the feedback we would get from these young people is like, what you're saying is nobody ever taught me how to have a good conversation with someone without getting mad, without having to throw something, without using language that didn't really help. I never really knew how to deal with my emotions. And so what I discovered in that process is that they were much, their hunger for these things was much deeper than I would have given it credit for. And so my perception of them was much different than what reality was. And I think that's what we find across the board. I know that's what you find in your work. That's what I find in my pastoral work within the local church. And so that's why we do what we do. So Dr. Marks, as we wrap it up today, any just final thoughts, anything you want to just share that might be helpful to church leaders in this area?
I love that you talk about these young people in their singleness. I always like to caution pastors. The purpose of being single is not to get married. I, somehow we've made singleness somehow inferior
Mm.
to marriage. They're not. I always say there's two vocational relational expressions: single and married. Both of them have the ability to express one of the two aspects of God's love. God's love is deep and God's love is broad. He loves the world, but he also loves deeply. Married people get to practice the depth of God's love.
Mm.
Single people get to practice the breadth of God's love. If I'm practicing loving broadly, my wife is going to get upset with me because I'm going to justify being at church and never home because I'm going out loving other people for Jesus and I'm neglecting the marriage.
Mm.
No, Rick, you get to practice deep love. They're single, they don't have somebody at home. They get to express to love broadly because they can. And so I believe those expressions, single relational expressions, married and single, really get to focus on an aspect of God's love deeper break, deeper broad. And if we understand that there are godly people who are single and ungodly people that are married.
Mm.
So it's not about getting married, it's just having healthy connections to God's self and others. And you can do that without marriage. And so
Well,
you need to have relational ministry to singles and youth so they are healthy and mature to go love broadly. And if God brings them their way, praise the Lord for that.
okay, Rick, that was worth the price of admission right there. That whole little moment right there was worth the price of admission. So
Came right
that's
at the
cool.
end, too, did it? Then.
Oh man, so good,
Oh,
so good, and that's why. Look, that's why we do what we do. Look, in the show notes, you'll find links to Dr. Mark's site, Relate Well. You'll find any other resources or things that we think will be helpful to you, and other information about what we're doing at MinistryBuilders.Church. So, Rick, thank you for being a part of this
my honor.
conversation, and man, so thankful to have you back, and such a rich conversation. I look forward to doing this more in the
I look forward
future.
to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, hey, everybody, thank you for being a part of this conversation, and I'm so um, I'm hopeful and thankful that you took the time to listen in, and I hope that you found some insights and some things that we discussed to be helpful because our passion and our mission is to see the local church make more disciples, grow more leaders, and empower more people for the work of the ministry. God chose to deliver his hope through his people, the church, and he does that in the context of our local churches. And so we're thankful for you. We're thankful for what you do. We're encouraged by what you do, and we're getting stronger and we're getting better together. So God bless you. Hey, be sure to share this. Be sure to share this video with somebody that you think this would be helpful to. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.